I hope I can take off my mask. We're keeping a safe distance here on stage. So thank you very much for staying with us while we waited for Professor Eto. My name is Eva Peshova, and I have the great pleasure and honor to be indeed appointed the new Japan chair at the CSES. We have heard it is the first and only such initiative in Europe, so it is a great pleasure to be back in Japan with this new hat and see many, many friends and hopefully new friends in this room. Thank you for joining us. And while we heard from our distinguished keynote speakers about the importance of the EU-Japan relations and of the growing closeness between Europe and Japan, we are here with this public panel to dive a little bit deeper into this relationship. What does it mean for stability in the Indo-Pacific? How can Europe and Japan actually join forces with other partners to bring more stability? I mean, how can we go beyond the bilateral relationship? How can we engage in multilateral settings? All this is these are very interesting topics to discuss, and I could hardly be in better company for that. With distinguished experts on both the European and the Japanese side, starting with my far left, Professor Naoko Eto, Professor of Political Science at the Gakushuin University and a Senior Fellow with the Institute of Geoeconomics. We then will hear from Dr. Daniel Fjord, who is the head of the Defense and Statecraft program at our CSDS. Then Dr. Ken Jimbo, the professor, well, he's the president of the Asia-Pacific Initiative and professor at Keio University. And last but certainly not least, Professor Dr. Michael Reiterer, who is a senior diplomat, very recently retired, and we have the pleasure to host him at the CSDS. Dr. Reiter has held many senior positions in Asia, including the last one being the head of the EU delegation in Korea. But I'll start with Professor Eto. You have been watching Japanese foreign security policy and Japan-China relations more specifically. So how would you see this kind of changing nature of Japanese foreign policy and security policy in the recent years, and where does the EU fit in?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind introduction, first of all. I'm Naoko Eto of Gakushu University, and I actually focus more on Chinese politics. So I'd like to discuss or share my thoughts on Japanese challenges, strategic challenges, based on the recent change of Chinese political regime, which was announced just yesterday, that the Xi Jinping third administration will be officially starts from the next March, but already seems started. And it's not only just restarted the political system, its political regime, but also it probably evaluating the role of himself, Xi Jinping himself, as the new leader of the new era of Chinese development. In my opinion, the most important thing that became very clear yesterday is that the Chinese collective leadership system has been dismantled, and it became a de facto individual dictatorship, which has a very big impact, not only on Chinese policy itself, but it will also affect the world how can I say, political stability, especially in East Asia, in this region. So I think what I believe currently is we need to see the Xi Jinping regime become more tougher, takes more tougher stance towards not only the United States, but also on particular some issues like Taiwan questions. I believe we will see more political rigidity together with tighter control of public opinion in China. and that's already evident in the dynamic zero-corona policy. Each political actor will become trying to implement Xi Jinping's decisions in an extreme manner, which makes it impossible to make flexible adjustment with full consideration of social impact. So at the same time, for the CPC itself, it has become easier to impose the behavior restrictions on the general public under the guise of corona correspondence. So people are deemed to have problems, no longer allowed to take a train, or even shopping at the supermarket. So what we observe currently is a deeper control of China society, which can result in a very, how can I say, implementation of the Chinese foreign policy become, how can I say, pushed by the public opinion, nationalistic public opinion, and made the choices of Xi Jinping regime smaller and tighter. In light of these changes in the domestic situation, I believe that Japan and the EU share the strategic concerns in two ways. The first concern is that the Chinese economy will deteriorate faster due to the inability to implement effective economic policies. An economic slowdown is a challenge for China itself, but many other countries will be also affected. So there's a common concern among us that we need to prepare for economic turbulence caused by China. Besides, the decoupling in certain industries between China and the US will continue as long as the Xi Jinping regime continues on its strong state strategy. So what we need to prepare for is much more complicated, especially in the economic security fields. The second concern is increasing likelihood that no rational political choices can be made, especially on the Taiwan questions. Irrationality is the downside of dictatorship, something similar to that we already witnessed in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the less accurate information is available to those who are around Xi Jinping himself, the more chances that they can make, or Xi Jinping can make, the wrong decision. So as a wrap-up, I'd like to raise two fields of cooperation. First, to corporate economic security as well as the ordinary economic cooperation, which may sound not very new to probably all of you, but I suppose it is even more important with the new administration, third administration of Xi Jinping. Secondly, we need to put more restraining pressure on China on Taiwan questions. So not only the security as security, but also the economic fields. In the economic field, we need to consider how to cooperate with Taiwan, and support the regional stability with no Taiwan hot reaction. I mean the real how can I say real attack or real how can I say gray zone attacks on Taiwan. I'm sorry that I somehow become nervous now and then just arrived, so I become nervous, and so sorry for that. Thank you. Anyway, thank you. I stop here.
Thank you. So much, Professor Eto, and thank you for pointing out on this need to for holistic dealing with the China challenge. I think, frankly, we have discussed also hybrid threats. I mean, this is something that, as on the expert side, we've been dealing a lot. It's also a topic that the EU has been dealing a lot. So I think on this particular point, there will be a lot to cooperate on with the European Union, for sure. I think the growing awareness of the China challenge is taking place, and it's a major shift in Europe as well. But for that, perhaps our second speaker could elaborate a little bit more, because otherwise I will be just occupying the whole stage. So please, Daniel, would you agree with Eto Sensei, and what would be the European perspective?
Now it works. There's a button. No, thanks very much. Thanks so much, and also to our hosts for being so kind with us today and being here. I'd like to maybe restrict my remarks mainly to the security and defense dimension of the relationship, and I know that some of the other speakers will speak about the relationship in more broad terms, but let me be as specific as I can. And of course, we all know of the, I would say, commonalities that already exist between EU and Japan. A lot has already been written. We're often described as like-minded partners, and especially on areas such as trade, multilateral governance, digitalization, security, and etc. And of course, we have both the economic and strategic partnership agreements as a kind of framing of that like-mindedness and appetite to cooperate with each other. Just maybe referring to some of these documents, because although they're commonly known and commonly, I guess, in the possession of many, it's sometimes quite interesting to go over the words again that are put in these documents. And I try to quote especially from the, firstly, the Strategic Partnership Agreement between the EU and Japan, which states, and I quote here, that as like-minded global partners, there's a shared responsibility and commitment to setting up a just and stable international order. I think both of the keynote speeches that we heard only a few minutes ago certainly go in that direction, certainly underline that fact. But they also stress, the partners stress in the agreement that they also want to closely address major global challenges, such as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, climate change, poverty, obviously infectious diseases, which is, I mean, many of us are still wearing face masks, so that's still very relevant. But I would also like to underline the fact that the Strategic Partnership Agreement also talks about the maritime domain, cyberspace, and also outer space as well. These are also areas, of course, that have got a lot more attention in the EU-NATO relationship. Let me also stress as well that beyond the Strategic Partnership Agreement, I think it's also very interesting to see how in certain government documents released on the Japan side and also on the EU side, they take this position or this need for cooperation even further. So if you look, for example, in the recent Japanese Defense White Paper, which not only has a beautiful cover, by the way, but also has really good content, I would say too. It also underlines the fact, and I quote here, that European countries themselves have demonstrated an active involvement in issues over Taiwan, which was already referred to. I think that's firstly quite an interesting observation about European countries. The paper also recognizes that Europe is a major defense and technological player, which is also important. And I'm also happy to report that it is one of the few strategy documents that actually refers to EU initiatives, such as the European Defence Fund, which is not normally common, I would say, but very good to see in the Defence White Paper. It stresses, of course, the important role of NATO and the EU as well, and their approaches to the Indo-Pacific. And I think what's also important here is what the Defence White Paper says on the Russia question and the war on Ukraine. And there it very clearly underlines from Japan's side that Russia's aggression against Ukraine has not only shocked the world, but it also stresses that unilateral changes to the status quo by force should never be tolerated. And this is the line which I think is very important. It also ends by saying the defiance of international order is not just Europe's problem, which again comes back to this issue of Taiwan and security problems in the Indo-Pacific more generally. The EU has also had its say on these matters too. Some of you may have already read it yourself, but it was certainly referred to in the opening remarks, that the EU has published the so-called strategic compass, EU strategic compass. Now this is quite an important document because it's the first time that the EU actually publishes what can be classed as a white paper or strategy for its defense policy. And that's really interesting because it is the only document that exists today where you can read about pretty much every element of the EU security and defense policy, from operations and missions to the need to develop capabilities, also for the need for partnerships in the area of security and defense, and also on a lot of the issues that have been flagged already about security of supply, maintaining a technological edge, etc. These are all important points that have been referred to and underlined within the strategic compass. Specifically on Japan, the strategic compass recognizes the importance of Japan as one of its key bilateral partners. Some of you may have already recognized that in past EU documents, the EU has shied away from singling out particular partners or even adversaries. The compass is a completely different departure. So it has no concerns about mentioning Japan as a core partner in its security and defense approach. The Indo-Pacific, of course, is a clear area of interest, despite the ongoing war in Ukraine. That's also another point to keep in mind, that even from the EU side, despite the efforts and resources going into Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific is still very, very much important. And it wants to intensify its relationship with Japan. And I think some of the areas have already been mentioned, such as maritime security, but even going further than this, cybersecurity is mentioned. And also, I would say a specific mention is made to the EU Global Gateway Initiative, which is the, for those who don't know it, it's the Union's Global Connectivity Initiative, developing infrastructure and so forth. So this is also mentioned in the context of the Indo-Pacific. I will try to skip in the interests of time a bit of what I wanted to say, but I think I'm okay. Just also to say that a few other areas that are underlined and I think of importance from a security and defense point of view is certainly this issue of supply chain dependencies and supply chain security. This, of what I would say, is one of the main cross-cutting issues in the EU's defense and security strategy. So not only in terms of the dependencies that we want to reduce in Europe itself, but also not giving the impression that we somehow want to cut ourselves off from the world. This is not the point. The point here is to make sure that we can also diversify some of our security supply chains, thereby making them more stronger and more resilient. And of course, Japan is also mentioned in this light as well, as being a very important part of that discussion. I would also say as well, it's not just the institutions, but it's also our parliamentarians, those elected to office or elected to their seats in the European Parliament. They have also fought very hard about the EU-Japan relationship in the context of security and defense, and also in terms of the broader union approach to the Indo-Pacific. And not only does it underline the importance of continuing in areas such as counter-piracy operations, and not only underlining the importance of more and deeper, I would say, joint naval exercises. But it also talks, and again, this was mentioned in some of the speeches and some of the reflections, about the need to deepen relationship in the area of intelligence, very important. Cybersecurity, capacity building was also mentioned, especially in relation to the maritime security dimension. And also, and I find this very interesting, greater cooperation in outer space. And I think maybe space has been mentioned already as well in some of our conversations, but it's probably one of those areas that we can push much, much further in our relationship. And here, maybe just let me share some of my views here, because I think also EU and Japan have a lot of common interests when it comes to outer space. So even, I would say, very quick on the back of the envelope calculations, last year it was stated that there are about 4,500 satellites in orbit. Japan and the EU together own about 100 or so of these satellites. So nowhere near the level of the US, of course, nowhere near the level of China. But what is important in this respect, I would say, is that we have a common interest in areas such as situational awareness and space tracking. And I think that's an obvious area of cooperation, not only because we're so dependent as economies on space, that's clear, but also it's one of those areas where this concept of like-minded partners comes into it. It's not just about protecting your space infrastructure, but it's also about thinking about the norms and standards that you want to set for the use of space. So it actually usefully connects back to one of the principal themes in this forum, also on multilateralism. So you can go from a very practical level of thinking how you can track space debris or objects to putting in place a multilateral structure. And I think definitely the EU and Japan can certainly push further on that. Now, just to wrap up very briefly, I think I have an obvious bias in space because it's one of the areas that I study, but I would also lend my voice to the calls that have been made today for much closer intelligence sharing and information sharing between the two. I think that that's a fundamental basis. We still have a long way to go, I would say, on this, but it is the basis on which we can build much, much deeper security and defense relationships. I'll stop there for now.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Thank you for deciphering all the official documents as well. I mean, it was one of those things that we always read, but then kind of, you know, it's always useful to get back to them, and much useful things we learn as well. It seems that pragmatism could be another of those like-minded values. We talk about democracy, human rights, you know, and rules-based order, but pragmatism keeps coming back, especially in the opposition to what Naoko was talking about irrationality on the other side and rationality on ours. But I'm moving forward to Jinpo-san. You're more focusing on the US-Japan relations and more of the US kind of led security architecture in the region. But where do you see the Europe and Japan partnership fitting in?
Well, thank you very much for your great question. And I've been preempted by Daniel's comment, and many of the things that I'm, prepared to speak has been overlapped. So let me try to focus on where the Europe fits in to the Asian security dynamics and multilateral architecture that we are developing right now. And at the outset, I think it's been great to see the developments that many of those European states and EU member try to regard Indo-Pacific as a gravity concept. So even though you're geographically not precisely located, inside Asia, East Asia, but seems to be that concept of the Indo-Pacific has created a common platform for every European members to craft its regional strategy. And it's good that we share those kind of geographical and concepts, regional strategy concept together. Although we may be different in prioritization of some of the areas that we want to focus, but Indo-Pacific is for everybody, and I think it's my own kind of take that Indo-Pacific can only be successful if everybody in the town claim the copyrights. So it is not the concept of Japan or the United States, but it's concept for everybody. So these are, I think, a very important platform that we can really share with each other. So I think that coming back to some of my my notes here, it's great that more European states regard Indo-Pacific as one of the major regions to engage in, and regard especially to China, as stated, as the direct strategic concern, which really expanded our areas of collaboration over strategy. And there are more European economic and security assets are forward deployed, I would say, in the Indo-Pacific region, and that would trigger a more decisive response on the part of EU and its member states. And for Tokyo's perspective, there are doubling down opportunity in following aspects. First of all, from Tokyo's point of view, I think EU plays significant role in leading norms and the rule-based international orders, especially in the issue of conflict. When we promote the rule-based international order, European voice is pivotal in forming perception standards in Indo-Pacific region. So, for example, China cannot ignore EU, stance, especially when China forges international campaign for its justification. EU's position on the maritime order, maritime jurisdictions, China's legal interpretation, human rights issues is a powerful force in our China strategy, because everything China tried to encounter in those contested areas of interest, they said it's a domestic issue. Nobody else should be involved in. But when EU comes in, this is the international issue. It's a global concern. That is a great, I think, force multiplier in forging our regional strategy. That's number one. Second, I think enhancing practice of cooperation and the institutionalization in the area of, as you mentioned, that for example, we can expand our joint exercises on the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation, capacity building of a maritime capability that is not only inclined to the naval status, but also with the law enforcement, coast guards, also like a judiciary measures, how we can really enhance the capacity of the administration of how they can really promote such kind of law enforcement. Those are great. And joint financing, for example, on the infrastructures, are all areas of cooperation that we can promote further. For example, Japan and the United States, Australia have came up with agreement in 2018, especially on the government financial institution like a JBIC, OPIC, now the DFC, and the EFIC. Those are the financial institution that actually have come up with the agreement. Why don't we, co-finance on the strategic infrastructure project that we face in Asia? We have had the first kind of joint financing in the underwater cable in the South Pacific Islands for the safety of the internet structure. We're also focusing on some of the infrastructure projects that we have in South Pacific and also in Vietnam. And I think those are some of the projects that the EU can also join in order to have more like a strategic financing project where probably that China wish to, take very much on the sense that they want to overrun some of those diplomatic influence through those financing projects. And we can actually have more like a flexible measures to have a joint counter-financing initiatives altogether. Finally, I would also like to see EU and Japan coordinate further on the supply chain management strategy, which is exactly what Daniel has outlined right now. For United States perspective, that the Biden administration, as you know, that have been in the process of the reviews of the vulnerability in the U.S. Supply chain, and it would promote formally called, Blue Dot Network or Clean Supply Chain, which all try to aim at having the supply chain without heavy reliance on one country, namely on China. But I think in order to encourage the corporate sectors to have a China plus strategy, or asking, getting out of China, you really have to have the multiple efforts to encourage them. Now, subsidiary is one, but I don't think that will be effective enough. We wish to have more like an alternative investing environments, enable those companies to, invest other than China to create a more, I think, economically viable option to be available. If the products are not, effectively competitive in making a new kind of supply chain, and then if those kind of products and services are not so competitive vis-a-vis Chinese products, and I think our supply chain reviews would not really make a difference on this. In that level, I think that the hard cooperation among those like-minded states are critically important. And in that regard, I think yeah, we need a more European engagement on that regard as well. And let me finish by saying, about the bridging partners, include the United States. I think United States and Japan has been formulating some kind of mini-lateralism, bringing in those like-minded states like Australia. Prime Minister Kishida has just been back from Perth, Western Australia, by having a koala in his photo, and we have actually came up with. I think tremendously important, like agreements. For example, like a reciprocal access agreement, and that is the important for the Japanese self-defense force to. Jointly operate with the Australian forces. I hope that those kind of legal platform can also be, expanded to other like-minded states, inclusive of, for example, Korea, ASEAN member states, India, and else. And if those kind of platform can also become an interface with European engagement in that region, and that's going to be a very important strategic standard setters for the future Japan-Europe cooperation. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Endo. I think especially also for mentioning the normative kind of power of the EU, that's music to many of our colleagues in Brussels, and we rarely actually see when we do go around. And the concrete areas, I think that definitely could work, including on the undersea infrastructure and partners. I mean, this is exactly what we're looking at, and of course we will be also looking at as researchers. But I will now pass the floor to Michael Reiterer, who has been following this EU-Japan, or the formation of the EU-Japan partnership since the very beginning. We've known each other for a good 10 years. That's not too long, but enough for following this distinguished career. And I know that he's been actually one of the voices promoting this partnership since the very beginning. So please, Michael, some of your insider's thoughts on this process and where can we go from now?
Well, thank you very much. Also, when you're the last speaker, you have to figure out what is left over. Indeed, I would like to have a little flashback, because I came to Japan 37 years ago, and I was working in the trade part of the Austrian embassy at the time. And what were we talking about? Well, trade frictions, tariff quotas for cars, alcohol sales taxes, and so on. A discussion like today, completely unthinkable. Fast forward, 2002, I joined the EU delegation as deputy head of mission. And I think there we started a sort of politicization of the relationship. We had the decade of EU-Japan cooperation, and were making some efforts, also in the people-to-people dimension. And I think we came to the conclusion that economics only is no longer good enough. Another fast forward, and we are today, and I don't repeat what Daniel already said and deciphered all the documents. So discussing this today is a quantum leap forward. And I think one should have that in mind, because it's my personal experience, so it's not that long, but nevertheless, we had a long development to go. And I think also the EU and Japan developed to a certain degree in parallel. Both the EU and Japan like to see themselves as a sort of soft power or normative power. And usually you will remember, and Takeda Sensei too, we had these long discussions with Tanaka Sensei at Keio University about normative power and who is leading whom. But I think today we are reaping a little bit the fruits of this discussion, as well as the politicization of the relationship. And now I see the European Union as well as Japan in trying to find their role. There's a lot of talk of being a responsible participant and becoming a global player and taking on the role which is commensurate with the economic might. And I think there, both, I see a lot of parallels there in moving forward, moving back, what can be done, what should be done, and I think there is something where we can learn from each other and also define common interests. It was my experience that also in the years 2000, we were telling each other what our interests are. And then we were pursuing our interests and we're hoping that the other is jumping on them. And I think there is again a change. Now we are trying to define the common interests and act upon them. That makes quite a difference. In finding a role, I think it's also very interesting if I look at Japan today when it comes to the security. I quote from the Constitution, "Trusting in the justice and faith of peace-loving peoples in the world." Well, I think in this volatile environment which we are, the trust is probably not enough anymore. And I think that we can see how Japan reacts and also the European Union reacts. So for Japan to consider to spend more than 1%, this 1% of GDP is also a big step forward and more might to come. In parallel, we see that in the European Union that 2% has become a real goal, and in the Peace Fund, which you mentioned, that the European Union is actually funding weapons to be transferred to the Ukraine, to a country in a war, is unique. So I think this is another important development. Also, the self-defense forces become more and more an army, and also thinking ahead that you have to have a capability to defend yourself in a forward-looking manner is new thinking, and I'm pretty interested to see what the 3 updated papers will bring probably by November or December when they are due. And I think then comparing notes again will be of great interest. Now let me jump perhaps to one of the issues which we have not touched so much upon, and this is some trade elements. You have mentioned the normative power, and I must say I'm rather concerned that we have now 2 big regional trade agreements where neither the European Union nor the United States, but they are no big fans of trade agreements anyhow, we have to be honest, are not part. Take the RCP. China managed to present RCP as a sort of Chinese initiative, which is wrong. It was created by ASEAN in Bali, and it was meant to be a strong symbol of ASEAN centrality, but it got somehow hijacked. Take the TPP. Well, TPP was part of the Obama pivot. And that was a good reason for President Trump to kill it. There, to the credit of Japan, Japan safeguarded this agreement and developed, I don't know who is responsible for this terrible name, the CPTPP, but I think it is an important step because if you compare these 2 trade agreements, you will see the second one is much deeper. And de facto, Japan has become a manager. Now, good luck with an application of China and Taiwan to join, and perhaps also Korea to join. But what is important, and I think this is exactly, trade agreements nowadays are not narrow agreements, but it is all about setting of standards. And I think this is something which is essential, and I think there I would put a little bit of burden on Japan to make sure that these agreements are actually trade creating and not protective. I think that will be an important part. And the bilateral agreements which the European Union is concluding, free trade agreements, may be helpful. It may also be helpful then when the EU-ASEAN agreement will be finished. But in between, I think there is quite some necessity to cooperate to make sure that we don't miss the boat. Another element which we talked about a little bit is data. I'm a fan of looking at these nowadays because I think data has become what used to be the oil of the old economy. In the new economy, data play an important role, and we will have to adapt to this. So the new emerging technologies are on the one hand based on data, therefore data protection beyond the GDPR, the private sector, is necessary. But the emerging economies, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, quantum computing, they all rely, and the name is already a program, on rare earths and rare materials. And I think there is an area where common action, because both the EU and Japan depend very much on them, is necessary. Because if we don't pay attention, then we will move from one dependency on oil and gas to the next dependency on rare metals and rare earths. And I think we should take action before we are faced with another scarcity or a weaponization and politicization, which we are experiencing right now with petrol and gas. So I think there I would see a big possibility, because it is common interest which have already been defined and which we should take. Now, just what I noted down in listening to the others, I think what is important, Daniel, you mentioned the satellites. We don't have so many, but I think we have a few which are essential because they form Galileo. And I think that the European Union has built up in a rather forward-looking manner an alternative or a backup, however you want to call it, to the GSP system of the United States is essential. And it was actually an early part in what we call now the discussion about sovereignty. So I think this is something we should have in mind. And perhaps also the last element, we had discussions about overlap of agendas. Yes, we have too many overlaps of agendas. But this is a long history in Asia. We have the ARF and we had the East Asia Summit. Lots of overlaps. But on the other hand, I think we should not only look at overlaps in an economic manner and saying, well, this is a loss of accuracy and this is a duplication. It also is a sort of offer which is needed, because we have many countries in the regions which would like to avoid in the Sino-US competition to take sides. So offering a broad band of possibilities and also promote the interests of the European Union and Japan together, I think this is also a possibility to offer stability and to avoid or help these countries to avoid what they don't want, and that is to make one choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's always great to have your intake. And it seems that Europe and Japan, when we think of one of those prospective areas, should basically go higher into the space or deeper to the sea to protect some of the rare earth minerals that you talked about. We have 30 minutes left for the discussion. I will just point out that Professor Eto needs to leave at 5:45. Is it still the case? Yes. So if you have a quick question to Professor Eto, please, perhaps you can take just one, if that's okay. And of course, I would like to hear, or do not hesitate to ask question to any of our speakers, or comment on whatever you would want. Is there any?
Or I actually would like to make a question.
Yes, please. Yes. No. Of course. Yes, you can react to each other.
Is it okay? Thank you very much. And as I am probably a specialist on China, and frankly speaking, I am the youngest here amongst the presenters. So I am rather, can I say, moved by how the specialists, distinguished specialists, can express themselves. So that probably I am the one who have more to take. But I would like to provide one question to you, because I have a feeling that we probably have a slightly gap among recognition how to deal actually with China. When I mean myself and Jimbo-san comments, basically we have a common understanding that we need to think how to deal with China together. But when the European colleagues make a comment on this region, you are talking about not only the East Asia, but from the broader context, from the Indo-Pacific areas, understanding what you need to do, what we can do together, Japan and EU. But the answer from our question, how you will deal with China, was not answered directly. You mentioned somehow you also concerns over the stability in this area. And what you provided ideas was effective to maintain the stability itself. But I have a question. What is the recognition over the China from the EU side? Could you?
Would you like to take up the question, Michael, or both of you, perhaps?
Well, I think the European Union in 2018 was the first institution to come up with this triptych that China is either a partner, a competitor, or a systemic rival. And in a functional approach, you have to define in which category a certain issue falls, and you act accordingly. The EU, I think, was more on the cooperative side. The EU concluded an investment agreement with China, which then at the end did not materialize, because in reaction to sanctions which were taken because of human rights, China responded with sanctions, and perhaps was not the best idea to put sanctions of members of the European Parliament who have to ratify the agreement. And you cannot expect any parliament to ratify an agreement if members are under sanctions. If you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, you will see it is underlined several times that it is an open one, but open also in the sense not an anti-Chinese strategy. I think this was also a clear indication in the strategy. What we have seen now in reaction to tensions in Taiwan and to the way China is developing, a discussion has started very recently also in the European Union, and I would say, if I have to define it shortly, instead that the order is changed now. China is a systemic rival, is a competitor, and is a partner. So reversed order, I think, reflects a change in the thinking.
Thank you very much. Well, there was an EU Council meeting just a couple of days ago, which pointed very strongly the European criticism of China and condemnation, but we are not 100% sure on what exactly we should be doing about it. So perhaps that's a topic for continuous discussion, including with Japan. But Daniel, would you like to?
Well, I mean, I can't really top what Michael has already said, but I mean, we have to think of the EU's way of thinking about China for the triptych that was mentioned. Maybe it has a kind of Catholic origin in thinking that we can keep all three things together But in reality, what you can see, and I think Eva said this really well, in the last European Council summit, there were some big disagreements between member states, between some who wish to continue keeping, I would say, a more commercial focused approach, and others who are very clearly aware of what is happening with the rise of China. I'm also tempted to say that I think the Europeans themselves would have less of an interest in the Indo-Pacific if it wasn't for China, even though we don't promote the fact that it's the rise of China that has maybe brought Europe a bit closer to that region. I think also on all of the issues which we've mentioned, in particular the security of supply, critical raw materials, I think these are all issues which are completely embedded in the China discussion. Maybe one of the things that wasn't mentioned so much up here so far is also on the, I would say, the power of over-opinion or disinformation or influence, propaganda. In recent months and years, the Europeans have felt that much more vigorously from the Chinese side, with the so-called, wolf diplomacy, where even researchers have had liable cases put against them, very vocalized opinions about Europeans in Europe and in the press, etc. So I think that there is a much greater awareness now as well of what channels countries like China may use. Not maybe direct diplomacy even sometimes, but even use of media, etc., etc. And I would end by also saying that Europeans now are also very much in a learning process. You have to understand that actually Europeans have been pretty naive about Russia in particular for the last few decades. And now we're in a kind of catch-up game of thinking, well, if Russia was able to do ABC, then maybe China will do ABC. So there's also a parallel learning process between the Russia case and also China. And that's going to be more important, especially in the context where we think Russia and China may work much closer together in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. Definitely, as China's image in Europe deteriorates, then the image and the importance of our democratic partner rises. And that's a trend that one day, hopefully, we'll explore more. More question, Luis? See, there's a question, and Celine.
Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you very much for the good discussion so far and the great overview on the EU-Japan relationships. I would like to ask our panelists a question because Europe is not only based on this side of the world. We do have some European territories also closer to Japan in the South Pacific. So there is some French territories there, part of Europe. And as you know, China has been expanding its influence also in the region. Recently, we've seen a tour by the Prime Minister Wang Yi, and a security treaty signed with the Solomon Islands. So I would be interested to hear from our Japanese panelists about how Japan see the Chinese, influence in the region. Do you plan to step up your effort also in the region to counterbalance this move, and how to work with the Europeans in this part of the world? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Celine, for your great question. You're right. I think South Pacific has become another gravity of the strategic competition between the United States and China. And obviously due to the strategic reasons behind the scene. And for China, from the strategic concept called the second island chain, expansion of the Chinese for deployed capability, naval access, they may be a good location for the access on the satellites, underwater resources. And moreover, that is actually the trigger point between United States and Australia, connecting those bilateral security activities in that region. So once that China penetrates by providing more like a financial assets and strategic aid packages to South Pacific nations, there will be a more, I think, robust playing ground that the China can expand. Minor issues, Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan maintains the diplomatic relations with some of those South Pacific nations, and they are, again, very vulnerable to those Chinese efforts to, offer those kind of, counter packages in order to, turn those diplomatic relationship around in favor of China. And obviously, the United States have stepped up its security engagement in the region. Recently, that Biden team has also reiterated importance of the upgrading the relationship with each other. So we actually discuss about it inside our groups and what would be the plausible Japanese engagement strategy, whether we should go together with the United States to engage South Pacific, or we should be, I think, more neutral in providing the grounds that the South Pacific nations can actually do not really have to think about choosing the sides between the two. And I think Japan may be trying to do the both in that sense that we do have the long-standing relationship of the Japan-South Pacific Islands dialogue processes. It's not as strategic as what we wish for, but still maintain as a very important platform among those, like a diplomatic counterparts in South Pacific nations. But at the same time, as I mentioned in my previous, remark, that there are a couple of like infrastructure projects which we are jointly financed together with the United States and Australia for some of those infrastructure projects they face, and including those underwater cable projects, and then counterbalancing the Chinese efforts to, create the lots of roads, ports, and airports. Those kind of, large-scale infrastructure projects can also be reconsidered as one of the, alternatives that we can really provide as a packaging project. Is something that we are now trying to compete to South Pacific counterparts.
Thank you very much. There was two more questions, one from Professor Suzuki.
Well, thank you very much for all the panelists for wonderful discussions. As a director of the Institute of Geoeconomics, I welcome all of you to come here, and I'm happy that we host the launch of the Inform and the launch of the Japan Chair program. But not as a capacity of a director of the Institute of Geoeconomics, but on the capacity as the member of the National Space Policy Council. I'd like to comment on what Daniel has mentioned. Yes, the space cooperation is an extremely important, and there's a lot of potential for Japan and the EU to work with. And I think it's not just a tracking, but also Japan and EU are now working together, or EU and ESA, the European Space Agency, working together to remove debris. So that's the one big step ahead to contribute for the international good for reducing the risks of colliding with debris and so on and so forth. And I think there is another opportunity that there is a competition between the United States and China for the exploration of moon. And I think this is again another area where Japan and EU, European states, as well as United States working together. But most of all, I think the most important part is the rulemaking. There is a lot of discussions about how to secure the Earth orbit and make sure that China is not going to shoot down the satellite, or Russia neither. And I think this rulemaking process, the role of EU is extremely important as as a normative power. But I think this is one of the area where you need to include all the actors, including the hostile ones like China and Russia. So I think this is where Japan and the EU can work together to establish some sort of a international consensus that this is for all, this is good for all participants in space. But also, I think the other point that I like to make is that not only we are competing with China, but also we need to be a bit independent from the US interest. Because the United States, of course, is by far the largest player in space, and I think we need to work together to counterbalance, not just competing with China, but also trying to establish some sort of a neutral ground away from the rivalry between the United States and China. And in that regard, I'd like to ask a question that how do you situate the Japan-EU relationship in the context of the strategic autonomy? Because the concept of strategic autonomy sounds a little bit, intriguing, or let's say not really comfortable in the context of the Japan-EU relationship. So how do you coexist the concept of the strategic autonomy and fostering the relationship between Japan and EU?
Thanks so much. Wonderful set of questions, very relevant set of questions as well. Yeah, I think, what we're experiencing in space is also a deterioration of multilateralism. That's very clear. And it is not just because the space treaty, outer space treaty is so old, but it is also because we have, as we all know, I would say rival minilateral formats in certain areas. And in particular, you mentioned exploration of the moon in particular. And the Artemis Accords in this regard, of course, are quite important because it's US-led. But increasingly, even within that context, you see some European countries, even reluctant ones, by the way, who have joined now with this. So it shows that possibly there's a recognition that the multilateral dimension is suffering somewhat, but we also need to protect against those areas where maybe the Outer Space Treaty was not so clear because the technology frontier wasn't as advanced then. On the other hand, however, I think the EU has made very, very clear its interest in maintaining, let's say, a certain degree of order, in particular when it comes to ASATs or anti-satellite weapons. And it was very interesting, by the way, that the Biden administration also signed a moratorium on this regard as well. So there is still a residual, I would say, interest in maintaining some multilateral dimension to outer space. But we're also very clear and not naive that adversaries are not bound by the same rules necessarily. So we also have to keep making sure that we have the ability, firstly, to coming back to the point about tracking and surveillance, that we actually know what's going on in the world. I mean, everyone is probably aware of this, but even the news that happened not so long ago about the use of Chinese hypersonic vehicles, which even from a technical point of view, because they don't fully go into space, cause huge headaches when it comes to tracking. So we still haven't developed the technologies in that dimension as well. So I think the need to keep up with the tech race is very important, but it actually goes hand in hand with the regulatory side. If you don't have skin in the game, how can you hope to influence things? On autonomy, I mean, this is a really interesting area for the EU in particular because when we say strategic autonomy, there is also a lot of bluster. I mean, in the sense that it's not a reality in many areas. The one area that it is a reality is in space. Michael's already mentioned Galileo, but we also have Copernicus as well. And now there are plans from 2023 to have an EU secure satellite constellation in space. So there is autonomy there in the sense that we don't have to rely on the US for these areas. You could flip the argument, however, and this was in fact the argument at the beginning when the Americans were politely telling Europeans not to develop Galileo, but to keep with GPS. The Europeans persisted in this regard. Now, you could say that was a strong act of defiance, but actually today the reality is that because GPS is militarily controlled, it might not be a bad idea for the US to have a backup system if theirs fails or are interrupted. So there are ways of framing this argument as well. where I think we have some questions, I would say, with regard to strategic autonomy in space, is that even though we in Europe have a capacity to launch, we have a capacity to put satellites into space, we are still severely dependent on the US for situational awareness and tracking. So you could make the argument that that's one area where you want to reduce your dependence, again, by maybe reinforcing the argument that it might not be bad for the US also to have partners and allies with a backup system. But then the cost, and this is always comes down to the cost, for Europeans investing in these systems is, it takes a lot of money, so it's an act of political will, I would say. And for the US, the cost would be allowing the Europeans to develop their own technology, own systems as well. I think in Japan probably you have the same considerations and questions. So that's also one of the reasons why we can develop that. Because I think also now, and I'll end on this point, I think there is an administration in the US who is listening to these thoughts and ideas. I'm not sure how long that will last, but we need to seize upon that right now.
We have time for one last question. Oh, Murakami.
Thank you for your fruitful discussion. And I'd like to ask you, Daniel-san, about one question. And in my perspective, Arctic could be a potential cooperation space between Japan and Europe. Arctic, yes. Yes, and in the economic context, it's very important. So there would be a new voyage line between Japan and Europe, and security-wise, it's also very important, I think. And Arctic should not be a backyard of Russia, and China is increasing its interest into the Arctic as well. So, what do you think about the mutual cooperation about this context? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another really important set of questions, not least because just like in the Indo-Pacific more generally, we have Arctic states in Europe. So there is an active and sovereign stake in the question of the security of the Arctic region. It's also important because it touches on different areas of policy. For example, you cannot talk about the Arctic without having a discussion about climate change. It's a victim of climate change, but it is also opening up, I would say, questions about environmental protection or biodiversity protection, all of these issues. But I think also touching upon some of the issues that were mentioned earlier, not only the context of opening up trade routes, which in itself has geopolitical implications, but also what was said about deep sea mining or subsea infrastructure. I mean, the more and more you open up these waterways and seaways and access points, the more and more you will have to think about deep sea exploration, etc., etc. And we already know there is evidence of the Russians in particular and the Chinese exploring the area for precisely these issues. In Europe, we have tried to stick to the multilateralization of that domain. It has a strong parallel with space, actually, that we want to have a multilateral solution. But the problem with multilateralism is that, not everyone plays to the tune, so to speak. So it is a very complicated region of the world, I would say. And one in which definitely the EU has had a real interest in. But it is also one of those areas that is complicated by the fact that it cannot just be, let's say, government agencies or governments involved, but I think, as was mentioned previously, a lot of private actors. I mean, it will be private actors that will drive the economization of the Arctic. The question we have is that, in places like Japan in Europe, we can separate commercial activities and state activities. Other countries are not so easy to divide in this relationship. So the private sector will be really important, but also making sure those norms and regulations can be enforced in that part of the world.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And let's remind ourselves that the Arctic is also one of the privileged stages of strategic competition, because Russia and China are extremely active, including in the scientific exploration and economic exploration of the area. So just one of the many. But allow me to conclude with a thought that I just thought of with Ken Endo's allusion to the Indo-Pacific being a concept of gravity, a gravity concept that has attracted all these different actors to formulate their own policies. I think one of the key reasons for the Indo-Pacific to attract all this attention is because it became synonymous to the debate about values. Whether we put China on one hand or others on the other, it is essentially a debate of whether we are going to be living in a world ruled by might or rules-based, by democracies or autocracies. I mean, this is essentially what really brought us together. And it is this notion of freedom and openness that the free and open Indo-Pacific concept and here that Japan brought to the table. And here it is Japan that is the norm setter, at least on the Indo-Pacific debate, that brought us to a large extent altogether. So I think not just the EU and Japan or Europe and Japan more broadly, but there is much that we can do with the Europe-Japan partnership at the center, but also with other like-minded partners around this globe. And I'm sincerely looking forward to starting this job because I realize it is just the beginning. And I hope that we will stay in touch with you individually, but also through the Japan chair. We will try to advance a lot of the points that we discussed in our research. So I would like to close this panel. Thank you so much for the 4 panelists, including Professor Eto that needed to leave us a little bit earlier. But please stick around. I understand you will have more guidance from our MC, but there is a cocktail waiting for us after this hard afternoon. So please do not leave and join me in thanking our panelists, please.
Well, thank you very much. We will have one more wrap-up session over cocktails and food. And we are delighted to invite you to the cocktail reception, which will take place here. But then we will need a little bit time to rearrange this room. So it would be grateful if you could make your way out to the foyer where drinks are already available. And we will let you know once the food is available, perhaps in 10 minutes' time. Thank you very much.